Guard, National Hurricane Center, Department of Homeland Security, and FEMA, the federal response to Irene has been massive, just as it is in every big natural disaster. But what if it weren't that way? My next guest has some ideas on that, and they've been causing a lot of talk and controversy. Congressman Ron Paul says if elected president, he'd do away with FEMA.
FEMA is not a good friend of most people in Texas because all they do is come in and tell you what to do and can't do. You can't get in your houses, and they hinder the local people, and they hinder volunteers from going in. So there's no magic about FEMA, and more people are starting to recognize that because they are a great contributor to deficit financing, and quite frankly, they don't have a penny in the bank.
Congressman Ron Paul, presidential candidate Ron Paul, joins us now. Thanks so much for being with us, sir. So you say we don't need FEMA. Why?
Well, we've only had it since 1979, and they don't have a very good record. I mean, these natural disasters are very, very dangerous, so I don't understand why we turn it over to a federal bureaucracy. Federal bureaucracies as a whole don't do a very good job, but FEMA has the worst reputation of almost any of them. And I live on the Gulf Coast, and I've had the same position all the time, and we've had hurricanes and disasters, and I get so many calls. I have had more calls on FEMA being upset with FEMA than all the other agencies put together. You know, when we had Katrina going into New Orleans, they needed ice, so FEMA ordered ice from the Northeast, and they ordered 211 million pounds of ice. It traveled for 2 weeks, and they finally ended up in Nebraska, and they never got it. But that's a typical way of how FEMA works. So if you want efficiency, why don't we look at how things were handled before we had FEMA? Now it's the Department of Homeland Security, and they just don't have a good record. But really, go ahead. I do have another bigger gripe.
But let me just say, I mean, look, I reported extensively on the failings of FEMA during Katrina, the trailers, the ice.
Right.
But I mean, they also had body recovery teams on the ground very quickly before other people, and that was a FEMA response. I mean, they do have expertise in some areas that some states don't. I mean, if you'd left everything up to Louisiana officials during Katrina, probably more people would have died.
Yeah, well, that remains to be seen. There's no proof of that.
But Louisiana officials certainly were not up to the task.
Well, the thing of it is, you create moral hazard by the government by saying, well, the government, you pay this, and the government will be there. They'll always be there to take care of you and pay your bills. Well, they're broke. They can't pay their bills. But the worst part about it is an economic consequence of saying, well, I can't afford my insurance. And these are usually, a lot of them are middle-class people who have their beach houses, and they can't get their insurance because it's costly, so the government guarantees it. So they give a reason for people to do dumb things. They build in the places that the market says, don't build here, it's too dangerous. And then there's floods and there's all these problems. And then when Katrina hit, some of the guard units, around the country that could have been helpful, they were over fighting wars in the Middle East. So it's such a gross distortion. No, things weren't as bad as it pretended to be before 1979 without FEMA. It wasn't a disaster. Go and show me where there was a much worse care before FEMA. And I don't think you can give me any of those any of that indication.
You talked about going back to 1900, but way before something like FEMA was around. But in Galveston, which I think as part of your district, it was FEMA who rebuilt it. They needed FEMA there wasn't a seawall in Galveston before the storm. And it wasn't, and they needed to rebuild because locals there decided that it was just too expensive for them to cover all of that on their own using local funds. And because they didn't, 6,000 people died in that storm. I mean, if FEMA were abolished, wouldn't you be setting a stage for life or death decisions or gambles, in poorer areas of the country?
My point wasn't, I pointed out in 1900, Galveston, which is in my district, they survived without FEMA, and they did rebuild the city, and it was mostly local funds. There were probably some state funds in, and that's when the seawall was built.
Right, but there wasn't a seawall there because they had decided to gamble because it was too expensive. If you had a federal government who was involved, wouldn't that be...
Anderson, wait a minute. The seawall was built shortly thereafter. FEMA didn't build the seawall in 1979. That's been around for a long, long time. You didn't need FEMA to build it. And just think of the management of all the levees in the country. Now they're starting to study even the levees on the river are probably making our floods much worse. The levees in
So you're saying there's
Orleans
absolutely no role the federal government should play?
Let me finish. They were all built by the federal government, and they failed, so the federal government had a lot of responsibility for the creation of the mess in New Orleans.
So you don't think there's any role for the federal government in disaster response? Or do you?
Rescue operations, I think so. And matter of fact, my approach, I think, was a very modest and reasonable approach when they came for funds, even today or back in the, when we got hit at Galveston. I said, I'll vote for the funds, but you got to cut it. We're broke. The economic condition of this country is dire. So you cut $2 billion from overseas, put $1 billion against the deficit, put $1 billion into helping the people that we taught to be dependent on the federal government. So I think that's very reasonable. But to say, oh, it's endless, the government will take care of us, and we're broke, and we're in the midst of this economic crisis, which is going to get a lot worse, and not be concerned about it and say, oh, well, the people need it. Well, I mean, from the start of FEMA being involved and taking over land control and taking over these management, they aren't very efficient. Yeah. They're very inefficient. They give no-bid contracts. Big corporations make a lot of money on this. They would have been better off in Katrina if they had just written a check to everybody and not gotten involved in all the mess that they did. They handed out checks to people that didn't even live there. I don't know how anybody could defend the inefficiency of what went on with Katrina. And that really hasn't changed. It's part of the Department of Homeland Security, and all you have to do is look at the TSA. That's another favorite bureaucracy that American people don't like either.
Yeah. Congressman Ron Paul, I appreciate your time as always. Thank you, sir.